Okay, we're back. The first slide with the well-known quote, "The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there." Keep in mind that this will come back to us in later units because it applies at any time in the past. And go back and review what it means if you don't remember at this point, since it will come up again in this class. So in these next few slides that have this same quote, we're going to partially review what we covered last time, at least to start with, but then I'm going to take you into a bit more detail about hunter-gatherers so that we can see something I already mentioned, and that is how complex their lives already were, how complex their societies and communities already were. Remember, we tend to underestimate people living in prehistory, thinking it was like cavemen, right? And dumb and bumbling and stumbling, but that's not the case. In fact, it, they were pretty much as intelligent as we are. We already established last time that they had to have lots of knowledge, maybe even more than we do, because they had to remember it all. But human beings, through the process of evolution, haven't changed that much in the last 100,000 years. In some ways, we're kind of like cavemen running around in a modern, high-tech world today. That's not entirely true. There's been kind of a resurgence of controversy about how gradual evolution and human evolution is. There's some recent scholarship that indicates that evolution can happen and seems, maybe has happened, I shouldn't say seems, maybe has happened to human beings even within the last, couple thousand years since kind of civilization began. But that's all, again, up in the air at this point. So we know they lived in groups, hunter-gatherers, that is, of 20 to 50, no more than that. Why not? Well, they're moving around. Remember, they're nomadic, it says here as well. And the technology, the organizational sophistication, pardon me, was pretty rudimentary at the time, so they didn't really have the skills, the knowledge, the know-how, the technology to live in larger groups permanently. But the main thing is they're nomadic. Doesn't make sense. It'd be impossible, for instance, for a city of 1 million people to be nomadic together, or at least that size. 1 million people to move here and there and around throughout the various seasons. By the way, hunter-gatherers didn't just roam around haphazardly. We already know that a little bit, but they tended to go back to familiar sites at certain times of the year. Be one place in the spring, one place in the summer, and so on. But sometimes things might change, so they might get to their usual summer location where they put up a campsite and stay, and find that another group has sort of beat them there, and they decide whether they want to fight or migrate and go somewhere else and find a new summer location. So though they knew where they were going and tended to go to favored spots at the right season, sometimes they had to alter that plan. Once or twice a year, they did gather with larger groups, as I mentioned before, but it didn't say why other than just to have fun. There were important things happening, apparently, in these gatherings, though I'm sure they were plenty happy to meet with larger groups and have fun when you're stuck with the same 20 or 50 people year-round. So what was happening of importance? An exchange of goods much of the time, so different groups of hunter-gatherers might have come across different types of food and tools or stone, types of stone to make tools, etc. And so trade goes on, which of course would be, hypothetically anyway, beneficial to sort of everybody involved. Information was exchanged, so sort of intelligence gathering and sharing. One group might have come from the west and is there to inform everybody, or does inform everybody, that there's a warlike group to the west that you might want to stay away from. And yes, mates. I don't think I have to go into detail, nor do I want to, about living with the same 20 to 50 people all the time if you don't see anybody else, and having that happen through the generations. So let's not go there. So this is one of the main reasons why it made perfect sense to meet up with larger groups. You want to, right, if you're a parent, and you've got marriageable children ready to have families. You want to marry them off to someone not in your group, but in one of these other kind of related, friendly, somewhat like extended family type groups, but not actual family, if you see what I'm saying. Um, we know they hunted wild animals from the large megafauna. Megafauna are the biggest animals in the Americas. For instance, it was bison, and or even bigger, the mammoths. But the continent's biggest animals were usually the first ones to fall, and the first ones to go into extinction. It's not entirely clear when and where around the world, possibly everywhere, though not clear anywhere, how much, if at all, human hunting caused the megafauna in various places, not all places, to go extinct. But it is possible, and I think it's even likely that human beings hunter-gatherers had a hand in some of these extinctions. There's a lot of evidence, I think, that leans in that direction. Though, again, it's not a slam dunk case. We know they gathered wild growing plants, seeds, roots, nuts, grasses, berries, fruits, roots, what's that, tubers, whatever. Some of the food supply probably wasn't that attractive to us today, but keep in mind they're eating what they can get a hold of, with the exception, we know, that they were quite careful in strategizing about what they're going to eat. But don't get me wrong, they're not going to pass up uh, you know, any food if they're starving. Those berries that we talked about in the last lecture segment, pardon me, right? They're not going to pass those up if they haven't eaten for days and there's nothing else in sight, or hasn't been. So that would figure into their calculations, into their strategy, of course, as well. The past is a foreign country, part two. I think I made this point already without the statistic, but for 99+% of human existence, human beings were hunter gatherers. It's only been in 1% or less of the time human beings have roamed and lived on the earth that we've been anything else. And these societies, as I said, developed quite an array of complex um, institutions and values. And one archaeologist has boiled this down to beads and stories. Simple way to say it, but I like it. I've been reading a lot of archaeology in the last several years. Some of the sources I'm using in this lecture you can see at the bottom of the page. All of those are excellent books, by the way, if anyone's interested in this subject. Perhaps not, but if you are, any of those are excellent books. So, the development of culture in beads and stories is really a reference to one, uh, material culture, sort of technological devices and things, possessions, beads, right? Jewelry, and stories is sort of the more intellectual and religious, spiritual, intellectual culture. So, but the development of culture we see again, having the advantage of being able to pass on information or accumulate information, that is basically culture, through a set of rules and shared kind of ideas. Not that they don't change and evolve somewhat from generation to generation, but there's a lot of continuity usually as well. So they pass on what they learn, they pass on the beliefs, the values, the attitudes, the know how, the knowledge, etc. This again sets human beings apart from all other species. To give us just a clue, and this is just this is the tip of the iceberg here about this will give us a sense, I guess, there's a way to say it, of how uh, in depth they went, hunter gatherers went to sort of make use of everything they could. So remember, they're surviving in nature in a way that we don't have to today. I mean, many of the things that we turn into products still come from nature, though there are some synthetic, human-made things as well. But they couldn't go to the local mall and buy products, so they had to find and make furniture, make baskets, make bowls, whatever they needed out of literal nature. No wonder you can kind of see them here through the examples I'm using, sort of looking at everything. If it could be used for something that benefited them in their community, in their society, they did, and they figured out a way to do it. So complex, innovative toolkit. By the way, that is a phrase that archaeologists actually use. When I first came across it years ago, I found it kind of strange that they're talking about toolkits. But they didn't. They don't mean literally like a kit or a box or a bag with tools in it. But they mean sort of the whole array of tools. Though it sometimes probably did come down to that. Use of fire is an important technological advance. We don't usually think of it as technological, but surely it was. We'll come back to that one. It's so important. We'll hold on off on it. They We know they use lots of stone tools, though the old Stone Age and New Stone Age as labels might be somewhat misleading, since though the great majority of tools that have been, remnants of tools that have been dug in archaeological sites over the decades have been stone. That doesn't necessarily mean that's what was there, in that kind of number in the first place. The reason being, of course, that stone is much more likely to survive over long periods of time in the ground than, say, tools made out of wood, bone, and other materials. So, and surely there must have been tools. So we're not even entirely sure that stone tools were the majority, although they probably were. We actually know for a fact that, for instance, bone tools existed because we have a few that did survive over the millennia. How? Well, various ways, but sometimes things like a bone might have been, a bone tool that got discarded or lost in a frozen over area, or an area that was froze over at one point, and then somehow in recent years or decades thawed out, and that ice basically had preserved that bone, and it was found fairly quickly, and wow, we have an intact kind of preserved bone tool here. So there are a few of them. You can imagine for an archaeologist that's like a gold mine. That's a treasured find. But other things, or from the stone tools, but also from again bone and other materials as well. Spearheads, arrow points, axes, knives, choppers, scrapers, and on and on and on. Needle and thread, another technological advance, which seems rather mundane and simple to us, but we need to be careful on that one. We'll come back to that as well. They made thread and needle from bone and animal sinew, multi-fabric stitched clothing from animal organs. Sounds kind of yucky, but remember, I said they're using everything. If they could put it to use, it came from nature, they did. Gourds for watertight bags, animal sinew and vegetable fiber for cord and rope, plant fibers for nets and baskets, robes from twisted vegetable fibers. And again, as I said, that's just scratching the surface. Much, much, much more. Animal organs for watertight bags. These people are resourceful when they're figuring that, hey, animal organs can be used for airtight bags. So this gives us at least a sense of how extensive their use of nature was, for their own purposes. So let's go back to fire. Fire, of course, once it was controlled, and that wasn't even always controlled then. There were out of control, fires that came from nature, like there are today. They couldn't do much, if anything, about those. But when they learned to start fires, right, for campsites, right, that's a major advance. The obvious reasons: one, right, to cooking your food, which actually is the most important one, but also light and heat, right, especially at nighttime. Um, Fire sometimes scares off predatory animals, so that can be useful in that sense as well. So all kinds of reasons to be able to conclude that fire was a major technological advance globally. But why is it that cooking food becomes the most important use of fire? Uh, because it tastes better? Well, no. I mean, that helps, but that's rather minor compared to its sort of a major historical function. And that is that cooking of food allowed human beings to be able to digest their food more easily. And so, over a long period of time, once the human body, generation for generation, became needed less intestines, less of their sort of stomach to break down their food for them, they end up getting sort of smaller guts, and that proved extremely important because it freed up energy for the body to increase brain size. Think of the body, and scholars often do in this kind of field of study. Think of the body as sort of having a limited amount of resources coming in, so it can't do everything. It can't build everything in the body an unlimited way. So like a government has to do, it has to husband resources and allocate resources for this or that. So the savings that the human body got from being able to reduce the size of the stomach and intestines because cooking of food required less hardcore breaking down of tougher fiber or tougher food stuffs, then what you see is energy and saved for mainly the brain. And so brain size, brain capacity, cranial capacity kind of takes off. This in turn posed some other problems and brought other changes. One of which, this will sound maybe strange if you don't know this already, you may, that there was a trade-off to be made here. When I say trade-off and the body does this, nobody's making these decisions. It's happening through the process of evolution over millennia. It's like it's sort of a decision being made. Nonetheless, the body had to make a series of trade-offs here. In a sense, nature was saying, okay, we'll allow you to have larger, brains, since you don't need the energy any longer for, grinding up your food, breaking it down. However, with the larger brain size, that's going to pose a problem in childbirth, because that bigger brain is going to have a bigger skull is going to have a tougher time getting to the birth canal, as only women can truly know. So what human beings have done ever since, again, they didn't plan it, it happened that way, and we don't think of it this way, but it really is true from a nature perspective, and that is that human beings, in order to have the larger brains, this is the trade-off that was made, they had to have their children early. Basically, all children are born prematurely, in a sense. I mean, even at like 9 months, that's still premature. If you notice, other mammals that don't have our, cranial capacity, at least not relative to the rest of the body, they're often sort of up and moving around and independent within like days, weeks, etc. Little puppies and horses are up walking pretty quickly. Right? Our little babies need us for almost everything for an extended amount of time. That's why, because in order to have bigger brains, you got to get the baby out quicker. Because if you allow it to stay in for longer in the birth canal or inside the mother's stomach for longer, it's not going to be able to get out. So all human beings ever since have had to have children. I mean, women have the children, but the fathers, mothers, families have to take care of them for a long, long period of time, in a way other animals don't have to do. So all of those things combined, and relating back to fire, shows how incredibly important the use of fire was through what seems to us an odd series of connections. Like how do you get from fire used to cook food, to human beings having larger brains and coming out of the womb earlier. Well, I just kind of told you. So getting to some of the cultural changes and zeroing in on some intellectual changes. About, I don't know, 50,000 years ago, roughly speaking, there's disagreement, that there appears to have been a cognitive leap, a cognitive revolution, as it's sometimes referred to by scholars, meaning that human thinking capacity, brain, mind capacity increased. And it seems to have been kind of a jump, not a gradual evolutionary process as human beings tend to develop at. And the I think the most accepted theory, though I'm not sure we're ever going to know the answer to this for sure, is that there was probably a mutation, just luck, that caused the ability, the thinking capacity of humans to sort of go through the roof quickly. And this and other things allowed human beings to really start to reason, right? To think consciously, to be able to plan, to be able to think uh, abstractly, to think symbolically, to think logically, to think mathematically over time, and increase those capacities as the millennia wore on. Uh, Human beings also do collective learning. We tend to think of ourselves when we learn as we learn individually ourselves and give ourselves credit for it accordingly, and we should give ourselves credit. If you get an A in this class, you do well in this or that in life, which requires thinking. You deserve credit, of course. Give yourself credit, for your achievements. However, learning it certainly is not done just by ourselves. Even if we pick up a book on our own, order it through Amazon or go to a bookstore, well, somebody else we had to rely on to get the book in the first place. Unless you print your own books at home and write them and print them. If you go online to look up information, if you to Google something, you're relying on thousands of other people. People that had to create the technology to build your computer, to create the software that you use, Google and its employees who you're relying on. So if you sort of really kind of keep sort of moving the circle outward of all the people who are directly and indirectly involved in you learning anything, whether it's history or not even just academic subjects, but learning how to, macrame. It's not just you. Uh, if you think of it this way, our textbook, let's just move away from history for a moment, say a chemistry textbook, if you're taking a chemistry class. We tend to, students, I was once a student myself, tend to think of textbooks as dull and boring. And sometimes they are, but if you look at it a different way, they're actually remarkable. Your chemistry textbook, and this is the same with all textbooks in any subject, is a distillation of hundreds of years of knowledge about chemistry in one book. Or maybe if you go through a whole degree, a number of books that you read to get your 4-year degree in chemistry. Nonetheless, that's generation after generation, decade after decade, you know, uh, one group of people after another that's contributed to experiments and discoveries and finds and writing and thought, correcting others' mistakes from other generation, all distilled into, let's say, in one class, one book, 600 pages. It's remarkable. So when you read your chemistry textbook, and oh my God, this is boring. What you have in your hands, people would have killed for hundreds of years ago. I have in this one book that I can sort of pick up and hold and open, and look at and read with ease. No physical problem in doing it. It's mentally, compared to what you'd have to do otherwise, is astonishing. I mean, imagine if you had to start learning chemistry from scratch. No one had ever done any thinking about it. No one had ever conducted experiments. No one ever discovered anything. You could spend a whole lifetime and you'd never, get very far. So this is where I said earlier that culture involves passing knowledge, from generation to generation, but it also involves people living in one generation at one time, all collectively learning together. We're all, in a sense, whether we mean to or not, sometimes we're, doing it for profit only, and then like Google, nonetheless, it's helping other people to acquire knowledge, and to, obtain information and use it to their benefit. So human beings, I think, again, we do learn individually in some ways to some degree, and deserve credit for doing so. But I think from a historical perspective, it's more useful to think of human beings sort of learning collectively. I don't mean it's a socialist enterprise. It can be done and is done, in our world. Individuals sort of working, for their own goals, but they still have to sort of cooperate and work together. And again, the internet, social media is a great example of this sort of taken to an extreme. Human beings also are the only species on the planet that is capable of large scale, flexible cooperation, as it says. So, what does this mean? Well, other species, first of all, there are some that can uh, be flexible to some degree, and but they usually can't be large scale. None of them can. Some can do large scale cooperation, but they can't do it flexibly. And humans are among maybe the most social of animals. In sociobiology, kind of a subfield of biology, which is controversial, the study is the study of the more social animals. And in the textbook that's dominated the field by Edward O. Wilson from Harvard has chapters on all of the social animals, from sort of the not as social to the most complicated or the most complex social animals, and human beings then take up the last chapter of the book, the primates, just before that. But on the list in earlier chapters are ants and bees, etc. Because ants are a good example. They they do large scale cooperation, maybe better than anybody. Millions of ants sort of in a colony working together. Ants are perfect communists. They are. They're programmed to work for the larger collective whole. There's no individuality whatsoever. Reminds me of that apropos old cartoon movie, I think called Ants with a Z, with the main character's voice being done by Woody Allen. He's kind of a neurotic ant, and the one ant in the colony that doesn't want to do things the rest of the way, or the way the rest of them do. The whole idea of the movie is kind of funny. In that, I mean, is funny, but it's telling in that sense, because ants don't think individually whatsoever. So ants make perfect communists, socialists. Human beings, not so much. In fact, Edward O. Wilson, brilliant Harvard professor. He might be retired now. He's won, I think, 2 Pulitzer Prizes in evolutionary biology and sociobiology. But his PhD thesis was on ants. I only know this because I've read a couple of his books and read something about him. But he's also politically involved. And years ago, he was asked about socialism, for human beings. And he snapped back in his answer, "Great idea, wrong species." And I knew instantly what he meant, because I knew that most people didn't. I don't know why I knew, and then I'd studied him, but that he'd done his PhD thesis in college on ants to get his PhD. So he's basically saying ants, yeah, they're socialism is a great idea. Ants can do it. Maybe with a few other species. Humans, not so much. Now, that's, of course, open to argument, nonetheless, he makes an interesting point. So, other animals can cooperate on a large scale, on a huge scale, but they can't do it flexibly, they can't change the way they do it. Right? The Woody Allen ant can't, he can't sort of change the social system. We need a liberal democracy, and to enshrine individual liberties and values, sort of, the rights of the individual, which is kind of the character that he played. But that can't happen in an ant colony. They're genetically programmed differently. They can't break out of that. So other animals can do large scale but not flexible cooperation. There are some that can't do large scale, they can do small scale, and then be somewhat flexible in the way they sort of organize themselves. The primates, chimps, and others are good examples of this. Uh, Not as flexible as humans. Sort of, we're going to down with capitalism, and we're going to bring in socialism, or the other way around. But they can be somewhat flexible. But the problem with those that are animals that are flexible is they can't do it on a large scale. I think the max for a chimp is probably the same for us too. I would imagine, roughly speaking. I think it's about 100 for a chimpanzee and maybe other primates. The numbers the same or similar. In order to cooperate, the chimpanzee has to know the other chimpanzee or chimpanzees. And so, how many people, other individuals, can you know? Like, I mean, know to the point where, like, I know this person well enough, I can trust them. This person I can't trust. That one I can. Oh, I know that person. I can trust them from previous experience. So, I just think about your own life. Do you know 100 people that you can trust? I know like three. No, I might be exaggerating there, more than that. But 100, that's a lot. I'm not even trying to know 100 people. Uh, I don't have 100 friends. I've got like 3 friends. So I'm not that popular. Anyway, I think you get the point here that human beings are sort of similar in this sense. Chimpanzees and human beings can't cooperate unless they actually have a personal connection and have trust. It can't be a more extended form of cooperation than that. One scholar, one of the ones mentioned at the bottom of the page here, in a TED talk that he did in London, used the example of Wembley Stadium in London. He was in London, so he used their big stadium there. If he was in New York, he might have said Yankee Stadium or something. But anyway, he said, if you put 100,000 human beings in Wembley Stadium for, say, a soccer game or a concert or something, things work pretty well. I mean, there might be, a fight. Somebody might spill beer on somebody else. Things go wrong. But overall, the event, soccer game or whatever it might be, comes off okay. But you put 100,000 chimps in Wembley Stadium, and it would be absolute chaos. It would just be pandemonium, and it's true. So, what is it that allows human beings to do large-scale, flexible cooperation? And I'm going to simplify this, though there's some truth to it. I'm going to boil it down to stories. Human beings can and do tell stories to each other. And stories, remember, human beings, by the time they're spoken and then written language, can memorize stories or write them down and then pass them down and spread them far and wide. And so this allows human beings to connect with each other and form kind of a sort of quasi-trust or a substitute for trust through shared stories. Now, stories, I don't just mean works of fiction, though that can be in there as well, but I mean myths, I mean beliefs, ideologies, values. So, stories about God or the gods that are widely believed by an entire society or most of the society. Sometimes it can be, say, multiple religious beliefs, and a chunk of the population believes in this god or gods, and a chunk believes in that. But it still finds a way to kind of hold the society together so they can cooperate on a large scale and still somewhat flexibly. The importance of stories, I think, is quite understood by our generation today. The importance of stories and holding things together. How do societies of millions, like our country, 330 million people, how do we hang together uh, since we can't trust more than 100 people or more than enough people that we can actually know and recognize? We can't know and recognize and then therefore trust personally 300 plus million people. It's impossible, of course. So how do we do this? Well, we have shared values. We have shared religions. Sometimes it might be sort of shared, values with regard to economic activity, consumers, etc. And these act as sort of a substitute for trust. If you have the same set of, if we believe in. Not everyone does any longer, but if we believe in American political principles from the Declaration of Independence and Constitution about freedom, equality, and democratic institutions, rule of law, etc. Right to right to freedom of speech, freedom of the press, etc. If we believe in those together, that can be something that binds a whole society together. At least it could in the past. I'm not so sure about right now. Maybe in history, anyway. I'm not talking about now as much, though I think it's somewhat true now. But throughout history, I would say the most important social glue. Think of this as sort of social, like super glue, in the form of stories that hold people together as a collective unit of large numbers beyond like a 20 to 50 hunter-gatherer group is religion. Religion plays, I think, an outsized role in history in serving that function. Now, I'm not saying religion isn't important for its actual religious purposes, for worshiping God and all of that. I'm not saying it's not important there, but we're looking at it from the social and historical perspective, and I think there's no doubt that religion has played it has played an important role, but possibly the most important role in allowing societies to sort of stay together, work together, and essentially provide that substitute for trust that you can't have for somebody that you don't know that lives hundreds of miles away, but still lives in your country, kingdom, whatever the type of political unit is. A human ability to think in terms of analogy, again, I said abstract thought, metaphorical thought and speech and writing, symbolic thinking, all these things are results of the cognitive revolution and allow human consciousness and thinking ability to take off in ways that, again, other species can't and never have been able to do. Let's just take one, symbolic thinking. Human beings can, we can think of things as symbols. So religious ones are a good example again. So let's say some leader of a hunter-gatherer group says to his band and says, "Hey, that tiger that we saw out there in the wild, uh, that tiger's spirit is up in the sky, and he's sort of the ruling spirit over us and watches over us and protects us." So they now have a tiger god. But human beings can then abstract, animals or whatever else it might be, and sort of think of them in symbolic terms. Right? That kind of thinking, as far as we know, other animals can't do. Human beings can. Our ability, again, to communicate, also using language, also is important, just simply because we can go into more detail. There are some animals, by the way, that are capable of conveying basic information about certain things, usually dangers. So I don't know, certain types of whatever they might be, lemurs or whatever, can make a sound that all the other lemurs know means tiger, and then a separate sound for elephants. Elephants aren't that dangerous. I guess they can be if they're storming, uh, but you get the point. So one sound, tiger or lion, whatever it might be. Okay, well that's useful, but it's not as useful as humans would like it to be. Right? If I'm in the middle of any place where there are lions or tigers, and I'm in a campsite or something, and someone comes in and yelling lion, right, and that's all they say, that isn't going to comfort me. What? Where? What are you talking about? When? Right? So human beings can explain those kind of things. Well, I saw, I was out 5 miles that way, and I saw a lion doing this and that, and then we can take sort of measures accordingly. So the ability to communicate not just flexibly, but in a complex way because of the use of language is also has been invaluable to human development. The past is a foreign country. 3, hunter-gatherers, again, retained an enormous amount of knowledge, used sophisticated patterns of thought about the world because they had to. Both of those things we know. They acquired lots of knowledge. They needed to. They stored it away. and their thinking patterns improved. The tool making shows it, the sequences of action that get more complicated over time. So sequential thought sort of means thinking in terms of, okay, there's this step, this step, this step, this step, which really is a recipe or an algorithm, which we already talked about. Vast amounts of information about their natural environment. You already know optimal foraging models, those 5 strategies that scholars have identified algorithms for determining a food's return rate, more or less. The value of gossip, another way that the human ability to communicate is valuable. This one's interesting because we usually think of gossip as something really trivial and not so nice to do. Because gossip usually means talking behind someone else's back, talking about somebody, and that's what it meant then too. And surely people throughout human history have gossiped in that trivial, kind of mean-spirited way, as we still do today. Unfortunately, we've all done it, and it's not the greatest practice in the world. But there's a value to gossip, right? In any society, any group, any community, any family, even, you need to have information and knowledge about who's trustworthy, right? If it's a hunter-gatherer group of only 20 to 50 people, if one person isn't on the same page, if one person isn't reliable in a group of 20, that could be a problem. That's 5% of your population that's untrustworthy. So you want to know who's smart, who's brave, who's honest, etc. Happens even at work at times, right? You talk behind another coworker's back when they're not there, maybe because you don't like them and you say mean things about them you shouldn't. But maybe it's because they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. Maybe they're shirking their responsibilities and you're getting blamed for it. And so you talk to another coworker who you like. Hey, do you notice that Bob, tends to not do the job and then we get blamed for it all the time? Yeah, I did notice it. Maybe we should do something about it. We should, say something. So gossip can be of value. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's pernicious. But certainly, you can see in a hunter-gatherer group of 20 people, 50 people, how talking about people to get an assessment of how they're contributing to the community is of the essence, was of the essence. It's likely that art first appeared in human history when our ancestors tried to reconcile the reality of life with their vision of what life should be like, according to the author of our main text. So I didn't mention this when we saw the cave paintings, but another possibility in understanding that cave art and other rock art and different types of art around the world in prehistoric times is that people are trying to kind of provide solace for themselves in a world that sort of seems bewildering and hard to control and hard to sort of make do what you want, because it doesn't much of the time. Sort of think about what is and what should be, right? Much art kind of has the by definition in some ways, art sort of is sort of looking at the ideals, not the way the world is, but how it could be, fantasy, or even realistic sort of idealism. So that seems to have been there pretty early on as well. The past is a foreign country. Again, some of this is review. Some of it is going into a little bit more depth. As I said at the outset here in this segment, values of cooperation and sharing, but still some competition, as we'll see. Reciprocity. What's this mean? We haven't covered this yet. Reciprocity, reciprocal, is mutual give and take. So the idea was that the cooperation that we've been talking about, and you see some cooperation and competition just in this, because what's sometimes called reciprocal altruism, altruism being doing good for others, not just for yourself. Reciprocal altruism means you, at least one of the reasons, and some would believe most or all the reason that human beings or one person does something good for another or others is not out of love and kindness, true altruism, true caring, but because it's beneficial. It's a good deal for both parties. So part of the reason, I don't hit my best friend over the head with a hammer when I get angry at him is because I don't want him to hit me over the head with a hammer in retaliation. So reciprocal altruism, although that's not altruism, that's just refraining from doing harm. But you get the point. This is where some competition can work in the, sort of be the one and the same, or at least the other side of the same coin as cooperation. I do think that we sometimes misunderstand cooperation and competition and see them as sort of like enemies. But I think that more often in history and in the world where we live in now, they're involved in more of a mutually beneficial relationship, if not always an easy one. Uh, uh, so Reciprocal altruism is a good example of this. Um, we can also sort of see this as what's sometimes called a non-zero sum outcome. Non-zero sum uh, is a term that came from game theory, which has now kind of become generalized and sort of entered the general kind of popular parlance of our times. Although game theory is quite complex, in the real version of it, but the phraseology like non-zero sum has sort of moved out into other uses as well. But what's being said here, something related to reciprocal altruism, is that even in cooperative societies, say where trade is going on, right, there's still a certain amount of uh, uh, even competition can end up being sort of cooperative. So if two people are trading goods, right, assuming one's not getting completely ripped off, which does happen, of course, sometimes, then it's beneficial to both parties. It's not a zero-sum outcome, means somebody wins, somebody loses. Normally in a trade, that doesn't happen. Again, unless somebody makes a terrible trade and the other person is ripping them off. Uh, uh, but and it doesn't have to even be equal. Somebody could get, they trade something away and get something back, and it can be 20% as valuable as what they traded away, at least in monetary terms. Maybe it's of great value to that person. Even a 20%, to 80 trade, right, is a non-zero sum outcome. Both parties benefit. It's not one gets all the benefit and one gets all the loss. There are, of course, zero sum outcomes as well in game theory in real life, but we're talking about non-zero because it kind of fits reciprocal altruism, values of cooperation that aren't just about cooperation. We'll skip the uh, uh, competitive feast giving, bargaining, free riders. That's worth mentioning for a second. Free rider is a term used for those in any society and group that don't carry their own weight. And believe it or not, and this is where you can also see that hunter-gatherers, as cooperative as they were, still had sort of a competitive element in there as well. No society that I can think of now or in history, including going all the way back to prehistory, appears to have liked free riders, people that didn't do their, hold up their end of the bargain, that didn't pitch in at least enough, didn't do their fair share, and yet sort of received the benefits. Now, in some societies and sometimes in places, the punishment hasn't been put them in prison or kill them. Sometimes it's been sort of shunning them, ostracizing them, shaming them until they come, get into line, that kind of thing. Which I think is the latter is more of the way you see it in hunter-gatherer society. Nonetheless, no society really wants to see sort of people doing sort of the free rider stuff, which is partly reason to gossip about them. Hey, somebody is shirking their responsibility. We need to talk about that person while they're not here. Again, I'm not encouraging gossip. I'm just telling you that in history it can be and has been valuable at times.